Hi, welcome to Tuesdays with Rachel. Today I'm going to talk about how to tweak a RightStart math lesson for a struggling learner. If you've not met me before, my name is Rachel and I have 4 children. 2 of them are struggling learners. One of my kids have been diagnosed with dyslexia, ADHD, and memory deficiency. My daughter has dyscalculia. She also has dyslexia, ADHD, and memory deficiency. Because of my struggling learners, I have done so much research on a variety of learning difficulties just so I can learn how to help my kids learn better. As a result, I have become passionate about helping other parents with struggling learners. In months to come, I'm going to have other sessions discussing how to help struggling learners learn better. In this session, though, I'm simply going to talk about how I have learned to modify lessons to help my kids learn better without tantrums, without fits, and without tears. Doesn't that sound great? Before we get started working through a lesson, though, I need to acknowledge that there are many, many, many different learning struggles out there. I understand that. Some of these ideas might work for you and some might not. These are simply things that I've done with my kids while I was teaching them at home and some things that I've helped coach other parents to use with their children. I hope you take some of these ideas and begin to see how you can make adjustments specific to your child's needs in their math lessons. In order to give you a glimpse of how I look at a lesson as a parent needing to make slight modifications to a lesson, I'm going to look at one particular lesson and share with you how I look at it from the perspective of teaching my struggling learner. By the way, this is the exact same lesson I showed last week when I talked about how to tweak a lesson for a gifted or strong learner. And even if you don't have a strong or gifted learner in your home, I encourage you to watch it because it will kind of give you a better idea of how you can modify lessons, not just in math, but in all subjects. The lesson that I'm going to be using today is from 2nd edition, Level B, Lesson 93. So if you'll hang tight real quick, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so here is lesson 93, and this is the full lesson. I'm going to pull out segments so you can see how I would look at each segment. The first segment is the warm-up. One thing that I want to start off with is you need to prioritize your lesson time based on your child's mental energy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, my son, literally, I'm not joking about this, had 10 minutes each hour to learn information. I had to consider how I was going to use those 10 minutes to help him learn as much as possible, which meant that I didn't necessarily do all of the warm-up information. So you need to take a look at your child, how much information they're going to learn in the day, and judge how much of the warm-up to do. The first thing I'm going to look at is these 2 first problems, and immediately I'm only going to choose to do one of them. Also, I am going to put it on the whiteboard. I'm not going to give it to them verbally. I'm not going to have him write it down. I'm going to put it on the whiteboard for him. This is my son. The other thing is my son, because he has dyslexia, struggled with writing. And if you have a dyslexic child, you know what I mean. They like to flip their letters and numbers, and they also like to mix their letters and numbers. So sometimes I would just take the pressure off of his focus on how to write the numbers and what order to put it in. And I would just have him talk me through how to solve the problem while I filled in the answers for him. The next thing I notice about this is it's also instructing me to have my son work through these problems without the abacus. Determine when it's best to use the abacus and when it's best not to. When you're trying to stretch your child a little bit with those math facts, then maybe you want to try to pull off on the abacus. But if you see a tremendous amount of struggle, let them use it. Let them use it. The purpose of this particular equation is really not so much do they know their math facts, is are they able to go through the procedure of how to do a multi-digit addition fact, when to carry, how to line up your numbers. So consider what your priority is when you're working on these type of problems and whether or not to allow the abacus. By the way, some days your child may need the abacus and some days they don't. I know with my son, he would need it one day and then the next day he was just fine. And then the next day he was just fine. And then the next day it was like he hadn't seen an equation before in his life. So I would give him the abacus. So it may change daily. Just kind of ebb and flow with your child's abilities. The other thing I noticed with this is there's a number of subtraction problems. I'm not going to ask my child all of them. I am going to maybe spot check and see if he knows, or I'm just going to jump to the new lesson material if I feel like I'd rather just focus on the new stuff and work on subtraction problems later on. The other thing I want you to take a look at is this last section. And the reason why I'm pulling this out, obviously this one's talking about telling time. With my son, he really enjoyed telling time. He loved geometry, and get this, he loved fractions. Who knew? But anyway, one thing I would do is leave this section in the lesson because he enjoyed doing it. I know this next part of the lesson, he's going to be working on arithmetic, which was a struggle for him. So when I saw things in the lesson that he enjoyed, I kept it in there, even if I knew for sure he already knew how to do it. A couple of reasons. One, I want to build his esteem, build his confidence, and I want to encourage him along the way. I want him to say, look what you can do. So keep those kind of things in there if that's something that your child enjoys. Do not skip sections if your child enjoys it. Build up their confidence. So here is the lesson part of or kind of the activity part of the lesson. And immediately I'm going to take a look at this top question. It says, or top statement, it says, enter 4 and 6 on the top 2 wires of the abacus. Now it's really giving the instructions for the parent to enter the beads on the abacus. However, I have ADHD children in my home, so I am going to keep their attention by letting them do as many of the activities as possible. So I'm going to actually have them put them on the wires. The next thing is I'm going to take a look at this question. What is the difference in quantity between 4 and 6? I'm going to ask that question first as it's written. But if my child is staring at me with glassy eyes and I'm like, they have absolutely no idea what I just asked them, then I'm going to reword it in a way that I think might help them understand. For example, how many more beads are on one wire than this other wire? So kind of rewording it. The other thing is when my child gives me the answer, so when they say there's 2 more beads on the 6 wire than the 4, I'm going to actually close and rephrase that sentence by kind of rewording that question. The difference between 4 and 6 is 2. So I'm kind of getting that terminology going in their mind so that they know what it is. The next time I ask, what is the difference between, they kind of got a better understanding of what that is. The other thing is I would have them repeat exactly what I said. So I would say, the difference between 4 and 6 is 2. Say that now. The difference between 4 and 6 is 2. When your child is saying that, it kind of helps in their memory. It kind of helps in their learning. So I would always have my kids repeat things after me as we were covering things. The next thing is ask the question, did you add 4 and 6 to find the difference? Well, now the answer is no. Really, it's a subtraction problem. You may need to rephrase that question if they're kind of staring at you, like with deer in the headlights. However, before you reject their answer, if they answer you wrong, before you reject it, ask them why. Because I had a son who would say something like this. If I said, okay, did you add 4 and 6 to get the difference? My child would actually misunderstand that and think, yes, I did add. I added 4 and 2 to get to 6. And by me asking, okay, how did you get that answer? It kind of helps me understand how they're processing that question. And they were actually correct in the way they understood the question. So don't be quick to disregard their answer and think that they're wrong. Dig deeper and find out why they answered the way they did. The next part is to kind of like the activity, filling in the whole part circles and writing the equations. What I did, I used the whiteboard a lot. I used it a lot. And what I would do is actually put the whole part circles on the board in one color, and I would let my son pick another color to put the numbers in. However, if writing is difficult for your child, have them tell you what to write, including the equations. Let them tell you exactly what to write. If they can't think of 2 equations, kind of give them a little hint along the way. So let's say they said 6 minus 4 equals 2, and you say, okay, can you think of another equation for that? And they're just kind of like, No. Then kind of say, okay, so if I have 4 and I add something to that to get to, so you're kind of leading them into thinking how to think. Oh, wait a minute, I'm adding now. Okay, so you're kind of helping them, giving them these little hints. You're not giving them the full equation, you're just giving them little hints along the way. Then you're going to repeat that section 4, 9, and 2. This time, you're going to try not to give as many helps as possible. Let's see how much they learned through that first round. So I'm going to ask them, put 9 and 2 on the abacus. What's the difference between, I'm going to use that exact same phrasing above. What is the difference in quantity between 9 and 2? And see what they come up with. If your child struggles again on that, what I would do is come up with another equation or another problem, which would be, and I wrote down here, what is the difference between 8 and 5? And I would go through this activity yet again, trying to get them to get a good grasp on it before I move on. The next section of the lesson is kind of like that heavier, trickier part. It's the practice, it's the problem. Here we have kind of a heavier material. As you can see, we're in double digits now. Before you start on this section, I want you to take a kind of like a evaluation of where your child is in their mental energy. If you see them starting to wane a little bit, then you might want to put a sticky note on this, close the book, and move on to something else. You can maybe return later on in the day and work on it, maybe after lunch, or come back to this section tomorrow. Because if you keep pressing on after they're starting to blank out, you're not going to teach them any more information. I've had parents who say, you know, they're spending an hour working on a lesson with their child. And my recommendation with them is, well, my question really to them is, okay, so when do they tweak out on you? When is it they're starting to gloss over? And most of the time they're saying within 15 minutes, 20 minutes, depending on the age of the child. And I come back to them, I said, you know, even though you're continuing to teach, no more new information is going in. So really all that extra time you're spending with them is not being absorbed. And not only are you frustrating your child, you're frustrating yourself, and they're getting to a place where they don't enjoy math. So keep an eye on when your child starts to tweak out and put a sticky note at that spot, close the book and move on. Come back to it later in the day or come back to it the next day. Okay, so here is the word problem. Let's say they've got energy, they're ready to go, or it's the next day. Here is the word problem. Now that's a lot of words, and my child has memory deficiency, so he's not going to remember the first part by the time we get to the end. So what I have learned to do is split it up into segments. Okay, the first segment will be this section. Michaela has a book with 36 pages. Now, the first thing that I do is I change the name of the person to like Logan, my son. I would say Logan has a book with 36 pages. But the other thing is I would also tweak the topic. So sometimes, like with my daughter, McKenna is her name, McKenna has 36 horses. Okay, so I would change it to the topics that they prefer. Why? Because I want to engage them in the conversation, get their mind at this is a life story. Okay, so they kind of make it real to them. All right, the other thing is I'm going to help them keep track of what it is we're talking about. And I'm going to make little notes along the way, and I'm going to have my child make little notes along the way. So here we have, Michaela has a book with 36 pages. I'm going to put M, notice I don't write the entire name, I just put M has 36 pages, and I just put M equals 36. And then we move on to the next segment of the question of the word problem, which is Nathan has a book with 50 pages. And again, I'm going to notate how many pages Nathan has. We haven't gotten to any problem yet. We haven't gotten to any questions yet. We're just collecting data. And I'm teaching my child how to collect data as they're reading the word problem. The next one, now we start the questions. Whose book has more pages? Well, with the data that we have written down, it's really easy to see who has more, right? Nathan has more pages. All right, then the next question is, by how many more? And this is the trickier part, isn't it? So at this point, I'm going to get the part whole circles. Again, I'm going to write them on the board or on a sheet of paper, and I'm going to have my son fill them in. And most of the time, my children were able to determine what number goes where. But if your child is kind of struggling with that, as my kids did periodically, I would say, okay, so which number is going to be the biggest? Do we know what the absolute biggest number is going to be? Is this the all together number? So, different ways you can ask that question. Getting them to the idea of, okay, the big amount goes in the top, and in this case, it would be 50, and then fill in the gaps from there. By the way, first fill in the part whole circles, but then the other thing is let them use the abacus as needed. Notice these are much larger numbers. So your child may need to use the abacus in this case. Take the stress off. What our goal is to make sure they know how to write the equations and how to break down the word problem. That's going to be your goal through this. So you don't want to say, okay, you don't know these math facts yet. So that's a whole nother issue. What we're wanting to do is making sure they're able to problem solve, which means if they're able to problem solve, you don't want them to strain and think about all of the math facts as well. So focus on one or the other, not both at the same time. All right. Also, if needed, when you're writing the equations, you can write the equations on the whiteboard for your child and then have them copy them down. And that's what I did a lot with Logan. I would write the answers up on the board. When we did our worksheets, we would talk about them and I would write the answers on the board and then he would copy them down on his worksheet. That took the stress and pressure off of how do I write my numbers? Which direction does it go? Which order does it go in? So that's just something to consider as you're teaching your kids. The next section of the lesson is the game and conclusion. This particular lesson has harder difference word game. If possible, play the game that's listed in the lesson. However, I do understand that sometimes the game might be a little too difficult for where your child is, in which case you're going to want to find a similar game covering the topics that you're wanting to cover. The other thought is if your child is struggling with a particular math fact, like you were working through this lesson, you're like, oh, wow, we've forgotten our basic subtraction facts. Play this game or a similar game. And then, after lunch or maybe after dinner, go and play another game that focuses on their struggle for the day, like a subtraction game or whatever it is for that particular lesson. Now that brings up this good topic. When do you play the math card game? If your child is too mentally tired to play a game at that portion, right after you finish your lesson, then stop, close your book, and play the game later on in the day. One thing that would energize my kids, though, is playing a game later on in the day with a dad or a friend or grandparent. I don't know who you have in your home, but or access to your children to play. But a phenomenon happened with my kids. I would work with them, I'd play a game with them, and they'd struggle. All right. But when dad came home or grandma came over and they played a game, all of a sudden they were showing off how much they knew. And they would all of a sudden do so much better in their math when they were showing off in front of grandparent, in front of friend, in front of dad. So I would recommend, at least periodically, finding somebody else to have your child play a card game with later on the day. Not necessarily right after the lesson. So also sometimes one other thing, I would do the lesson in the morning when their minds are a little fresher, and then we would go through some subjects and then have lunch. And then I would play a game after lunch before we jump into some more things. So they've had some mental rest, and that sometimes worked really well with us. The conclusion questions. The conclusion questions I asked throughout the day in a very casual manner. It was not a drill. I was just, if it was equations like what is 2 plus 3, I would catch my child going up the steps and, hey, Logan, what is 2 plus 3? Or I put him on a toaster strudel. I did that several times, what is 2 plus 3, but you can't eat the toaster strudel until you give me the answer. Or I would holler out, he's jumping on the trampoline and holler out, Logan, what is 2 plus 3? Find different ways to ask these questions so they don't feel drilled, but you're kind of getting a feel for whether or not they retained the information, they got the information. And I just said that, asking questions throughout the day. Extra helps. I've discussed a lot of different things that you can do in your math lesson. Let me kind of recap some of them and bring up some more. First of all, reword questions and problems. If your child is just kind of like hemming and hawing after you ask a question, reword it. find a way to reach their mind, let them think of it in a little different manner, and then put it back in the original term. Have your child repeat what you said. Use manipulatives as your child needs them. Just because the lesson says do not let them use the abacus, if your child needs it, your struggling child needs it, bring it back in. If you find an area that your child enjoys, include it as much as possible. If your child enjoys geometry, bring it in as often as possible. If your child enjoys using the math balance, bring it in the lesson. Even if it's not in the lesson, bring it in. Find a place to put it, because that's going to lighten up your child and bring more information into their minds. Teach within the limits of your child's mental energy. I can't emphasize that enough. Stay within that parameter. That may mean, though, you teach part of a math lesson in the morning and part of the math lesson in the afternoon. That's okay, but you're staying within the limits of their energy for that time frame. Tag a lesson if you've surpassed their optimum learning time. It's okay if you don't finish a lesson in a day. It is okay. That's just going to happen. And I had to get over my type A personality a little bit when I was working with my kids. And guess what? They still learned it all. But you have to kind of go with ebb and flow with them. Finally, add laughter and encouragement to their lessons. Find ways to make them giggle. Endorphins, when you're making them laugh, endorphins are shooting off in their minds and more information is being absorbed. So you want to include as much as possible laughter. Make them laugh at you. Do something silly, whatever it is. Sit on the floor, play with them, whatever it is. Make sure you're adding laughter to math. If they do something wrong, kind of giggle at it and just not making fun of them, but giggle at it and say, oh my goodness, I've made that similar mistake, whatever it is, just make light of it. Also pour a ton of encouragement on these guys. They know they are not learning as fast as their peers. They know it. They know it. They know it. And they feel that in their hearts and their minds. Your role needs to be the encourager. Find different ways to do that. You're like, wow, you did that really fast. Or can you believe how much you've learned this week? Or wow, you didn't know that at the beginning of the school year and now you do. Look how far you've come. Throwing those little bits of encouragement, because learning for some of these guys is really hard. So building them up as much as possible will help them continue to press on and learn more. A word of caution though, do not skip math. Do not skip math. There will be days just like, oh, I just don't feel like it. I mean, I don't know about you, but at least for me, it's like, I don't feel like doing it today. But don't do that to your kids. My child, I told you before, he has memory deficiency. If we skipped a math day, it was like skipping a week or really a month. We would have to go back and review some things that we had covered before, and it was just too much time had transpired and he lost that information. Do not skip math, even if you just do a little bit a day, even if it's just playing a math card game, whatever it is, do not skip math. And speaking of math card games, do not skip the math card games. Those are vital to your kiddos keeping those math facts in their minds. I cannot reiterate that enough. Make sure they play those math card games. The goal is to teach your child to learn as much as they can to their ability of learning, while helping them appreciate and enjoy math. We don't want to just pour tons of information on them while they're crying, right? They're not going to learn any information that way. Helping them to learn as far as they can, but still enjoying math. At the same time, we don't want to have so much fun with math that we don't progress them. They can do more than what we think they can. So encourage them, stretch them, and when they reach their max, pull off. So I want to leave you with a word of encouragement coming from my experience in teaching RightStart math with my struggling learner. So I had a child tested when he was in 5th grade, Logan, just so I can see how far he was behind. The psychologist went through all the testing, and at the end of it all, she sat down with me and she gave me his results. And of course, much of what I suspected was true. He was several years behind in reading, several years behind in spelling, a couple years behind in vocabulary, but his math was almost on target. He was like a half a year behind. She asked me, what in the world are you using? And I told her RightStart Math, and she said that she had never heard of it before. But then she said something that just kind of struck me. She goes, whatever it is, do not stop using it. Your son should not be doing nearly as well in math as he's doing with the degree of struggles that he has. I just encourage you, even though some days are hard, keep plugging away, keep plugging away, keep plugging away, because your child will get it, and they will thank you in the end. These are just some things that I have learned along the way in helping my struggling learners learn. I hope you were able to get some ideas that you can apply to your homeschool. If you have any questions or concerns, post them here on Facebook. If you have a topic that you want to hear me talk on or my experience with, post them on Facebook. Or you can email me directly at rachel@rightstartmath.com. And if you found this video helpful, I hope that you click the like button. And if you know somebody else who has a struggling learner, share this video with them. You never know, you might make their day. I hope you join me next Tuesday as I answer the question that is repeated over and over. Do I really need to play the math card games? Until then, have a great week.